You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. So glad that you've joined me today. I want to today take a deep dive into a subject of leadership that has fascinated me for, frankly, my entire adult life. And it's how do we lead during times of turbulence? And I'd like to begin with my favorite quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcomings, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, when he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Today, I want us to dive into the subject of leading in turbulent times, and I could think of no one better to discuss this with than my friend and my pastor, my boss, the president of the U.S. Foursquare Church, Reverend Glenn Burris. Glenn, welcome to the podcast. So thankful that you've made time to be able to be with us today.
Well, it's a fun day, Jeff, and I've loved hanging out with you and hearing the way you think. You're a critical thinker, and that means that you tear down things in a way that you understand how they work. And it allows you to reproduce things. It allows you to help other people get to use them. So anyway, thank you for your leadership in Foursquare, especially in Europe and among the missions team that continues to discover what God's doing around the world to advance his kingdom.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your kind words. You know, Glenn, I mentioned to you when I asked you onto to be interviewed that one of the many characteristics that I've seen in you that I admire the most is probably the one leadership characteristic I admire the most about you is your ability to lead during times of turbulence. And over I guess it's been 11 years of working together at some level, that you've been I think you were 1 year interim, and then you're finishing up 10 years as president of the denomination, and which, by the way, congratulations.
Thank you
on finishing well. And it's a hard task, to finish well, and you've done good. I appreciate that. But I've looked at it, that the turbulence in leadership comes in three broad categories, I think. One is the turbulence that you inherit when you become the head of an organization, whether that organization is a local church or, in your case, a denomination. There's a turbulence that you initiate by your own leadership initiatives. It's been said that everybody likes progress and nobody likes change. And yet you have initiated some change, and I'm sure you've experienced some turbulence because of that. And then finally, there's turbulence that we experience from external factors, things beyond our control. They're not within the organization. They are outside of the organization, but they certainly affect the organization, like the pandemic that we are involved in right now, the economic situation, the 2008 economic downturn that we all went through, and especially the political and cultural movements right now of Black Lives Matters, left versus right, the polarization that's taking place, not only in within the American scene, but all throughout Europe, we're seeing a vast polarization as well. And so wanted to pick your brain about each one of these categories. And let's begin by looking at the turbulence that you inherited. Now, when you became president of the U.S. Foursquare Church, our movement was facing some very turbulent situations. pastors and leaders from across the denomination were very upset about some very significant, serious issues. And all of a sudden, you were the man responsible for them, even though you may not have created them, but they were yours. You owned them. And you had to come into a place where you had to lead out of that. How can you unpack that for us? How did you embrace this process of the turbulence of things that you've inherited?
Jeff, I really like the outline you've given, because I think unless we look at things in unique categories, we tend to lump everything just into one trip. But there are unique journeys, and I think the journey that every leader has coming into a new situation is that he's probably rarely given credit, and shouldn't be, for the past successes, but he bears the responsibility for the failures or the inconsistencies of the leadership before him. And I know that because I think the leader after me will inevitably have to experience some of the challenges of things that either didn't get finished or didn't get done or could have been done better. So it's not a reflection on a person. I think it's just it's a general sense that when you walk into a leadership role, people convey their emotions toward the position of authority, or
Right.
toward the person who's bearing the responsibility. And sometimes I think we put too much on that role. I think you're the first person I heard use this term, that our ultimate goal is the whole gospel taken by the whole church to the whole world. And I think when we move in an opposite direction, then I think that we're making too much of a particular leader. So then everything rises and falls on their success or failure. That's not to minimize the responsibility of a leader. When I walked in, I'll still remember the first conversation I had after I became the interim president. Someone called me and said, "Hey, there's 4 or 5 pastors that are pretty concerned about some things. Would you meet with us?" And I said, "Sure." So we planned to meet in Portland. And by the time we met, we ended up with 22 leaders. And I spent 10 hours fielding some very critical questions from them. We asked them to submit their questions ahead of time, so at least we knew where to start with. We brought some information. It was interesting that it took a couple calls with the board of directors to actually get them to release me or empower me to share information with them, because they felt they weren't sure of the motives of some of the leaders. And my thinking was, if we don't have them on board, we're never going to figure this thing out together. I think, Jeff, the first thing you do in the middle of turbulence is you have to get down to what reality is. Because if you're living in a bubble, if you're living in false assumptions, if you're living with false realities, then you'll end up defending what you've done rather than owning it. The scripture that came to me, Jeff, was, because everything for me in leadership has to have some kind of a spiritual foundation. It may not be clearly identifiable, but I clearly remember being in that meeting and sensing the Lord saying, "Judgment begins in the house of the Lord. You're never going to have the moral authority to lead unless you lead by managing in a way that doesn't induce unnecessary criticism." In other words, I've found leaders who want to get to solutions, but because they continue to be a part of the problem, you can never get to the solution.
Yeah.
So they have to be committed to removing the obstacles to get to other conversations. Understand this: when the initial conflict you have a certain set of conversations. It's all revolving around the perceived or real pain or disappointment. And you can never get to larger conversations unless you address that.
Right.
Think about a marriage. If there's a conflict, a deep conflict in a marriage, you can never get to other important issues until you first resolve that one. It's almost as if you're in a pause or in a stuck mode. And so some people just keep going around the same mountain, a little bit of what Israel did in the wilderness, because they could never really get to this place to trust God for their future, no matter what he did, no matter how many miracles that happened. And so I think it took, it kind of took them getting out of that mentality of being trapped to
Mm-hmm.
begin to believing there was a different future than what they had experienced. They were operating in trauma, Jeff, in my opinion. So
Right.
when Pharaoh shows up, they all of a sudden say, "Well, you brought us out here to die." So um, Moses at that point was having to field the long-standing frustration and disappointment of people, not only in Egypt's leadership, but in God himself. So
Mm-hmm.
they weren't even believing God. So it's not a matter of pointing to a leader and saying, I'm going to be better than that leader. It's just understanding it's the nature of people when they face pain or trauma or disappointment, um, for them to look for somebody else to blame.
Right.
So I think the point was, first of all, owning that as a movement, deciding there are things that I could do and I couldn't do, but I was going to be responsible for the things that I could change. So we focused on a couple things, Jeff. We focused on transparency. We focused on the discipline of financial issues that were a main part of the concerns. Um, we focused on rebuilding trust. I love what I heard an elder say at one point when the leader said, "You can trust us," and the elder said, "When I tell you I trust you will be the day that I'm actually trusting you
Right.
versus
Yeah.
when you tell me I can trust you." So I think that there are things that you can only earn, Jeff, through time and through practice and through disciplines and through consistencies and through perseverance. You're not going to gain them just by making promises. You're not going to gain
Right.
them by words. I think what I would say is where a lot of leaders miss it is not discerning the difference between short-term wins and long-term wins.
Mm-hmm.
So the short-term win in Portland was just listening.
Okay.
It was not offering defenses. It was not offering excuses, but it wasn't overpromising. It wasn't trying to say everything will be fixed tomorrow. So you have to have some short-term wins, but then there has to be a long-term commitment. And so sometimes we just want to pacify people and still do the same things that we're doing and assume that that's going to pacify people. But I really took the notion of what deep change might mean in our
Mm-hmm.
organization and how could we change the culture. Jeff, I grew up in this movement, so I've known for a long time that there existed this undercurrent of us versus them.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in LA or whatever, and that's typical of corporations, right? I mean, it's typical of
Right.
people who seem to have an enormous unbalance of authority or power or access to resources or whatever. So my thought was, what if you level the playing field? What if you don't just say you're going to engage more people in conversations, but you really do engage them?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that got us on the right track. At least what it did is it kept anybody from bailing at the moment. I think we kept everybody around the table, and many of
Yeah.
those are serving in leadership roles today. Some are supervisors. One of the guys that was there is the president. So, I mean, it wasn't as if Randy came with a lot of anger or frustration.
Mm-hmm.
He just came as an interested and concerned person who was
Mm-hmm.
probably recruited to the meeting, but
Mm-hmm.
still. Jeff, the last thing I'll say about this and any follow-up questions, but the difference between a revolution and a reformation, and I think a reimagine, which is what we did,
Mm-hmm.
was a revelation happens when people have no longer believe they can get any movement from its leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So they revolt. Sometimes it's violence. Reformation is when people decide to create an alternative option for people. They don't necessarily have to tear down the existing leadership like Martin Luther did. He just created a different pathway. And so
Right.
the Protestant Reformation came because he was unsatisfied. But in both of those cases, a revolution and a reformation, whether one's violent or one creates a different pathway, it's concluded that leadership is not open to change.
Right.
The last one, I asked the question, Jeff, when we were going through this to myself. The Jerusalem Council to me feels more like a reimagined environment. Here's why I say this. Because they began to ask themselves what they needed to do to change, to make an empowered culture available for people who didn't have the authority to do that. The Gentiles didn't have the authority to do that. So what happens? This is the question I always ask. What happens if the leaders take the initiative to change versus are taken out in a revolution? Or a whole group of people leave and they create another alternative, and you continue to lead the way you've led. You just lead with less people or different people. But what happens if leaders are always initiating the change and the transitions and the transformations? And I think the Jerusalem Council is the target for us to find out what the Holy Spirit is saying, to find agreement between us, and then move together of things that advance the kingdom.
Yeah. Now, Glenn, you said earlier in your answer about pastors or leaders can't fix the problem if they continue to be part of the problem.
Yep.
And one of the things that I noticed about you and your leadership, which was unlike most models of leadership that we had been given to us within Christianity, at least in my experiences within Christianity, which was, the pastor, he or she is like a prophet. They hear from God and then they come tell us God's will. You engaged in questions, and I remember one of the phrases you used to use, you still use it, but I remember you would distinctly say, my leadership style is I listen, I learn, then I lead.
Yep.
So is that part of what you're talking about when you said you can't fix the problem if you're continuing to be part of the problem? Is it rooted in that ability to listen, first of all?
And I think we have to unpack what the word listen means, because if you're just reading an email or if you're just sitting in a meeting, what does listen really mean? I'm sure you watched the Dr. Phil show.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes he's sitting there and people are going back and forth and he's saying, do you get it? I mean, are you hearing what they're saying? Because they're not showing any empathy. They're not showing any true understanding. And I think one of the greatest gifts, I don't even know if it's a gift. It may be an acquired attribute that people learn to listen. They really try to catch the heart behind what is said, not necessarily what is said or even the anger by which it's said. So much to the point that when Moses came to the conclusion of his ministry, Jeff, I'm still today awed by the fact that God wanted to wipe Israel out. And Moses said, if your justice requires a life, take mine. But you've made them a promise. Wow. Now you know, why did God choose Moses to lead Israel?
Yeah.
Because that was the kind of heart he had, that at the end of the day, he was more concerned about their future than he was his own. And so I think that's what listening does. Listening suggests that your goal is to create opportunities for people to unravel the own obstacles in their own life and get to the greatest potential that they have. And they'll never get there if they don't see a humanity in you and see a willingness in you to continue to unpack your humanity and your entanglements and obstacles. The greatest two words in a marriage is I'm sorry, and sometimes if we can't get there, sometimes it's I'm sorry because I've hurt you. Sometimes it's an I'm sorry because this has wounded you. This has hurt you. And so I do think, though, that you can't get to progress if you don't settle that first issue. If
Right.
you don't get to some common understanding. Remember the First Continental Congress wrote King George and they said, let's sit down and talk. And he goes, no. And that's why they wrote a second letter. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary. Well, think about that phrase, in the course of human events. What events?
Yeah.
Events where the king said, I don't care what George Washington says. I don't care what Thomas Jefferson says. I don't care what John. I mean, these were statesmen. These were incredible leaders. And I think if you don't value them and you only value maintaining your authority and your power. And so I think in the local church, Jeff, or even leading any ministry, you have to really be open. Solomon taught us that wise counsel preps us for victory.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you can't just say that. I know a lot of leaders that can spout leadership. They can quote other leaders, but do they actually live that? Is that a value for them? Yeah. That's a great thing that we need to assess when we're assessing leaders. Do they walk with humility?
Mm-hmm.
Are they able to acknowledge? So you say to a person, so tell me a time where you made a mistake and took ownership for it. I mean, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Tell me where you made yourself vulnerable in front of leaders. I'll never forget, I was in Germany, and I don't know if I've told you this, but I was around a group of table. It was with Ewald Zomer, and two guys at the very end of the table kept talking the whole time. And so when I got ready to talk, I said, surely when I get ready to talk, they'll quit talking. And so I was talking and they were translating for me and they were just talking at the end of the table. And I almost said, listen, it's very disrespectful for you guys to stand at the end of the table and keep talking. But I didn't say anything. I just held my tongue. And later you all said, oh no, the one guy was translating for the other guy everything that was being said. So, and I thought because if I wanted to make it about me, that they needed to listen to me versus taking the time to understand that they were actually operating in a very healthy way.
Well, one of the things that you brought out and that I've seen you live out is you seem to understand the difference between who you are as a person and your role within the organization. You don't confuse the two. You don't, and that you also have a sense of self, which I suppose is that sense of self-identity that brings about a humility that allows you to listen and respect other leaders, even if you disagree with them. I mean, I've sat with you in meetings and we've seen very hot conversations, and you've always been open. You've always lived this way that people could tell you whatever it was they're thinking. And, as long as it's being, even if it was a disrespectful, but they would always generally do it in a respectful way, even though it might be very passionate. And you never retaliated against that. Now, how did you develop that kind of a process by which you're distinguishing between your self-identity and the role of the organization, so that when they're criticizing what's happening in the organization, you don't take a self-defense position?
Well, I would say I never appeared to be defensive. I think internally, every leader takes a mark when someone criticizes the organization. Right. So because you feel responsible. Mm-hmm. So the difference is whether you feel responsible or whether you feel, it's not that, I don't think you can totally remove who you are, your feelings, your emotions. But I would say this, at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you're an owner or a steward. And in an organization, especially when you're the CEO or the president, you have to always lead more like a steward than you are an owner. you're able to walk in and lead at the highest levels, but you're also able to walk back out the door and leave it. And it's, you know, you and I talked about this before the podcast. It's a John the Baptist. It's,
Right.
I must decrease that he's increasing. But then Jesus modeled it when he said to disciples, I'm leaving, but I'm sending the Holy Spirit. I mean, Jesus made that decision. They didn't want him to leave, but Jesus actually understood that if the Holy Spirit multiplied leadership among them, that what they would accomplish would be greater than what he could do on his
Mm-hmm.
own. So as a leader, your goal is to get people to rise to a level of competency and calling and character that isn't as easily experienced if you're the one who's always leading. So, Jeff, I put it like this. I mean, I've heard few leadership podcasts or books or whatever talk about this. I think the greatest example of leadership is parenting, because I think you're not raising children, you're raising adults.
Right.
So how do you get them through the phases of, you know, everything depends on them, or they want everything, or they're throwing tantrums, or they're making bad decisions or bad choices in friends, or get bad attitudes of their influence. And you know, Solomon said it this way when he prayed, and he became the king. He said, I want wisdom to govern your people, Lord. And to me, that was such a very powerful admission that they weren't his people. I've heard
Mm-hmm.
people talk, this is my organization or
Right.
my people or whatever. And so I think you have to live with a certain sense of stewardship. But another thought, Jeff, is that you have to live with a confidence in where God is taking people, not necessarily where they're at, but where he's taking people. So
Mm-hmm.
you eventually become committed to a direction, not a decision. So most leaders, if you think about it, they're defending a decision, whereas my goal is always just to get people going in the right direction.
Mm.
Because if you get people moving together in agreement toward the right direction, then a lot of the decisions along the way that we tend to argue and I'm sure even God finds it humorous with some of the things that we debate and argue about, when ultimately it's, will this get us to expanding God's kingdom?
Yeah,
And so,
that's great. You know, I don't think I've ever told you this, but years ago when our denomination was going through the presidential um, selection, early stages of the presidential selection process, I was in a conversation with one of the people who was involved in that. And they were just out asking, what kind of president do you want? What kind of a, you know, what gift mix, blah, 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 blah. And I said, look, the only thing I care about is that we would get a president who sees their role as president as a steward of the movement,
yeah,
not as an expression of their own ministry.
yeah.
And I really do commend you, Glenn, that you have lived that way as a steward. And I think that would be the highest compliment that one could aspire to. Well done, good and faithful servant, good and faithful steward.
Well, thank you.
Let's transition into the turbulence that you create because of your own leadership initiatives. You have initiated several leadership transitions and things, part of this Foursquare Reimagine. Is there a particular one that stands out, that, or maybe the whole, that you've faced some particular issues of turbulence with? And if you did, what were some of the ways that you navigated through that?
Wow, Jeff, that's a loaded question and a good one, but it's, you know, when you're leading and you're imagining a future, right? I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
you're, whether you're a husband or a wife and you're contending for a future, or you're the leader of a local church or leader of a business, you have to imagine what the future looks like and try to direct people there. If you're not, you're not a leader. But then again, there's no guarantees. So I think one of the biggest challenges, Jeff, is realizing you're asking people to make a huge investment in where you sense God is taking you
Mm-hmm.
without actually knowing whether all of this is actually going to work. Um, when we went into the presidential transition process, and asked people to consider letting us do it a year early. Some of the conversation that happened, and it
Mm-hmm.
was righteous conversation. It was good debate. Sometimes all you know is that this is the right direction, but I don't even know what all this means. Now, what I see is while it cost us a little extra, but it allowed Randy to transition Beaverton well. So
Mm-hmm.
Beaverton wasn't sacrificed in the process. It didn't overwhelm him with responsibility up front. It allowed him to kind of wade into the role. It also allowed us not to have a lame duck session. At any moment, Randy was ready to pick up something and run with it. I let him. So
Yeah.
there was nothing like we were waiting around and couldn't make a decision because if I made the decision, the next leader would have to live with it. Well, now the next leader's here, so we can have those kind of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want us to make that decision? You want to put a pause on it? I think with Reimagine, it's similar, Jeff, in the sense that by the time we got to Dallas and presented the stakes, we had been to 23 town hall meetings. We'd probably had, I'd say, 50 task force and committee meetings,
Mm-hmm.
multiple board meetings, supervisors, area missionaries. I mean, there's lots of conversations. And the biggest proof for me is I look back now 6 years ago, because it was in 2014, and we're not having to backtrack. I mean, we're
Right.
not necessarily having to, oops, we made a big mistake there. Now, I would say we're still learning with some of those, whether it's options with churches and properties, or whether it's how to align the foundation to Foursquare. All of that's been good. And in fact, um, we've added probably 125 million to our portfolio, so we probably have 2 million more to give away. Now, it became obvious that we needed some of the foundation equity to replace some of the tithe. So we use some of that to help with missions and the Bible college. But in reality, we give 12.3 million back to our local churches today
Mm-hmm.
through the tithe return. The foundation was only given 2 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
So just to show you that there was some help in one way, but then it released a much greater potential in the other way.
Mm-hmm.
But when we had to reduce the corporate size so that we could really resource the frontline teams, that was painful. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
because you're having to think these are people's livelihoods, these are jobs, these are I do remember early on when we started talking about giving the tithe back, the administrators in our building, I mean, it was kind of like they couldn't quite imagine,
Mm-hmm.
because everything was about, I mean, it's a business model, getting more revenue in,
Mm-hmm.
not giving revenue away.
Mm-hmm.
But Jeff, our tithe was up 15% last month in the middle of this pandemic.
Wow.
We're actually still up almost 3% for the whole year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really an interesting thing to what happens when I think you walk in obedience, you walk in good counsel. But it's not been easy. I mean, having to walk people through that kind of change, but I will tell you, almost everybody who understood the sovereignty of God not only landed on their feet, but wouldn't go back and change things. I mean, in other words, uh, they are doing much better. They're happier. They're more engaged. So I think at the time, it feels the emotions of it, the change, it feels weighty. But if God's really in control of our life, no man, I've had to feel that way when I've been under authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to feel that way when you're in authority,
Right.
that the sovereignty of God is more important. Now, if you're reckless, Jeff, I think as a leader, if you are unwise, if you are not submitting to counsel, but everything that we did was bathed in prayer and lots of conversations. And so, as painful as that is, um, you realize changes even in the New Testament when things happen. There was an initial even Paul going to Rome, there was a reaction. You can't do this because we need you.
Right.
And Paul said, no, the Holy Spirit's calling me to Rome.
Yeah.
And so how do we, I think maybe the key that the question you're asking is, how do we help process, not just make decisions, but how do
Hmm.
we help people process change?
Right. That's the big question.
Yep.
And do you have a running track going through your mind of, because not only have I watched you excel at the ability to really empathetically listen, you excessively communicate. You have a particular message that you, and I'm not talking about your preaching messages. I'm talking about your leadership
Sure.
that you're communicating to the Foursquare leadership team, ministers and all, that it's almost like a continual loop. And one of the books I'd read years ago that really transformed my life was Leading Change by John Cotter.
Yep.
And one of his points in there was to communicate 10 times more than you think necessary.
Sure.
And what role does communication play, and how do you think about communication uh, when it comes to these leadership initiatives that helps bring that stability and clarity?
Well, one thing is and Randy's learning this adjustment, but you communicate differently to a congregation than you do a denomination, because
Right.
in a congregation, you're with them on a weekly basis, or even now, if you're not physically with them, you're at least communicating with them on a regular basis. In a denomination, it's intermittent communication, and it's sometimes second and third hand. And so you have to find a different way to shape culture, to influence people. And now think about national leaders. So you're experiencing this in Europe. How
Hmm.
do you affect change with people you may see once a year, you may see twice a year?
Hmm.
Um, here's my kind of a short outline to process, because I think everything has some foundational principles to it. I think change starts with a concept. It's a flawed concept, but it's an idea. It's
Hmm.
a sense of direction. Then I think you move into some sort of counsel. Um, I think you're. I think good leaders start asking people around them, "Hey, what do you think about this? Have you ever thought about that?" But you're not in a decision making moment.
Hmm.
You're in a give me some feedback. You're in a
Right.
council, help me see what I don't see. Then I think you move to the third phase, which I call collaboration. Then you actually start assessing things. You start evaluating things. That's the town hall meetings. That's the administrators running the numbers. I mean, you don't just say we're going to give tithe back. You eventually have to say, what does this mean? You don't just say we're going to give churches property options. What
Hmm.
does this mean with our
Hmm.
polity and with our legal status? And so that's part of the collaboration stage, where you're not afraid of reality. You're not afraid of information. You're not going to interpret the information based on where you want to go. You want to let the interpretation then to help direct you to where you're going. Fourth stage, then, Jeff, would be conviction. You're actually at some point looking for, okay, what is the Lord saying? That's driving the stakes in the ground. That's
Hmm.
conviction.
Hmm.
Now, too many pastors confuse concept with conviction.
Yeah.
So they get an idea and all of a sudden they run to conviction, which the next step beyond conviction is commitment. So if you miss those middle pieces of counsel, collaboration, then the conviction you have is all internal. It's not one shaped, it seems good to us and the Holy
Hmm.
Ghost. So it's
Right.
been shaped by debate, argument, conversation. And then the last thing I would add in the C's, Jeff, is communication. And that kind of goes all the way through the thread. But you do have to, at the end of the day, communicate clearly where you're going, reinforce that, give updates, let people know. Here's the interesting thing about Reimagine. Two thoughts that I think would be important for people to know. Steve Mickle, who is a great pastor in Bend,
Hmm.
Oregon, set me down on a Wednesday night. I was getting ready to minister to his congregation on a Wednesday night, and he said to me, "I know what you did with Reimagine." I said, "You do?" like there was some clandestine agenda. And Steve said, you gave us the resources and made us responsible for the mission. I said, you got it, Steve. I mean, if there was an agenda, it was believing that the ultimate responsibility of the mission of the church was in the hands of people,
Right.
not just a local pastor, not just an associate pastor, not just a missionary, but for everybody. But I only have the initial ability to push it down from me
Mm-hmm.
to the next level of leaders. I don't have a direct relationship with members. I don't have, does that make sense? I don't
Yeah.
have direct
Yeah.
relationship even today with national churches. So I leverage my influence with those elders and leaders that I have.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, and Steve brought this up in his orientation at the board meeting a month ago. He said, Glenn, I think the next phase, which I've said in a number of occasions, the next phase of Reimagine is where all the leaders hold each other accountable for how they're doing resource and how they're doing mission. So imagine today you're getting 50% of your tithe back, or 40%, and 10% goes to retirement. But pastors are saying, so what are you doing with your money? How are you investing in the community? How are you
Mm-hmm.
investing in evangelism and discipleship? So now the conversation isn't vertical.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation is horizontal. So
Mm-hmm.
now we're holding each other accountable, which is kind of the phase, in my opinion, of how change happens. It's parenting 101. It's
Mm-hmm.
you're parenting your kids, and now your kids are parenting their kids.
Right.
So it's the Paul to Timothy model, um, Jeff, that says, what I have given to you, find other faithful men who
Mm-hmm.
will teach other faithful men. So at some point, you're only teaching one, or only influencing one layer, but it's how you influence them that determines whether it'll go beyond that layer.
Mm-hmm. That's
And I think
great.
that's the difference between teaching and discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Is discipleship builds into it some sense that the person you are helping to change, transform, become a more ardent follower of Christ feels the compulsion to go do that with others.
Right.
And that's that parenting instinct that your kids end up having. And so then you get the joy of being a grandparent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's innate. If you look at the whole model, it's just that if you only cut things in a section of time, if I only looked at what you did with your kids in the first 6 years, you don't really see what you see today.
Right.
So we have short term and long term, and I just think that's where leaders don't always get it either. Is there's short term activity that's going to produce long term results. There's
Mm-hmm.
the agricultural part of the New Testament that says plant seeds, water, and God gives the increase. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure we're so measurement oriented. I just decided somewhere in my life, Jeff, that I would take the criticism for people not necessarily seeing the change immediately
Mm-hmm.
and investing in what I believed would be long-term change.
Right.
So when Randy was asked about Reimagine, he goes, well, here's the one thing I know about Reimagine. We all decided to go there.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like this was a vision. Glenn went up to a mountain, came down and said, okay, here's where Foursquare is going. We got there together.
Right.
And there'll be different initiatives, there'll be different priorities, but I can't imagine we're going to shift aligning everything to the Great Commission.
Mm-hmm.
That we don't want to be a catalytic culture, that we don't want to empower and resource people. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
we don't
Yeah.
want to align everything that we do in a symbiotic synergy.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I discover about most situations. If you go into a local church or even in organizations, things are just disconnected. There's not an integration.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that segregation, like even in our own country from
Mm-hmm.
our racial history, happens without any effort.
Right.
People gravitate socially, they gravitate ethnically, they
Mm-hmm.
gravitate um, in things that they feel comfortable around, that homogeneous unit.
Right.
Missions says it by its very nature of being cross-cultural,
Mm-hmm.
says that you cross boundaries and start building an integrated community
Right.
and efforts. Now, God said all along, I want a he said, I want a kingdom of priests,
Yeah.
and so only a few of them became priests, but God's commitment is that we would all become priests.
Yeah.
So I think for me, reimagine, Jeff, wasn't the end. It was an attempt to move us culturally to a place of empowerment, alignment, getting down responsibility as low as we could get it,
Mm-hmm.
but taking the first step.
Right.
Because if you ask other people to empower, but you're not empowering people, or if you ask other people to resource, but you're not doing it. So to me, it's a matter of setting an example, affecting the next layer of people that you can affect. That's the discipleship model Jesus did, but do it in a way that they will keep infecting people.
That's
So when
great.
people say to you or to me, I'm watching what you're doing and I'm going to practice it, that's the highest compliment anybody can say of us.
Yeah.
I'll have guys like Isan and Turkey say, I've watched you in meetings, Glenn, and I go back and I practice the way I see you lead meetings. And so that's a form of discipleship,
It
because you're
is.
modeling something, but to me, it isn't a program. It's a set of values and
Mm-hmm.
principles where here's what I think Isan was saying. You value people.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I realize I don't have to operate out of authority, out of
Right.
power.
Right.
I can operate out of influence. I would
Mm-hmm.
rather operate out of influence than I would out of power. And
Right.
so, and those guys, they've all said this. I've not asked them, but whether it's Volker or whether it's Leslie or Isan, they've all said something shifted. And it wasn't me. It was the environment we created together. They were ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
They just said, we've been invited to the adult table.
Hmm.
We have conversations that mean something. We
Yeah.
went 25 years without a summit,
Right.
1987 to I think 2012, and they wanted to have one 9 years later because they said that was so impactful to us. We came so far because you listened, we made decisions together. And so those distinctives, I mean, you can debate them, but we all spent a day and a half
Yeah.
saying amongst ourselves, 233 leaders, what is Foursquare? What does it look
Yeah.
like around the world? So
Yeah.
I love, Jeff, none of us want to build short shelf life initiatives,
Right.
that somebody else comes and has to dismantle. And you've put a lot of money in it. It'll even get dismantled while you're leading if you quit putting money with it.
Yeah.
So, but what can you start that has a life on its own?
Mm-hmm.
That I think is kingdom stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've really observed in you is the truth of the fact that there must be weigh-in before there's buy-in.
Yep.
And you gave people tremendous opportunity to shape something so that they owned it, because it's like I said, if you go to them and you've got this ready-made thing, it's like you use the word collaboration. Well, most people, I think, use that word collaboration errantly. They think collaboration is, I've got this great idea of something I'm doing, you should come help me do this.
Sure.
And it's, first there must be shared creation before there can be shared collaboration.
Yeah.
And you've really shown that. And you've also, I love, the idea that in order to save something, you've got to give it away. That, you see so many people trying to protect the ministry, and they're not letting people in because they're trying to protect the ministry. Well, that doesn't protect the ministry. That just kills it. The way you save it is to constantly give it away. Now
Well,
let's
even in
shift.
pastoral transitions, I've seen families broken apart because fathers and sons oftentimes could not walk through that transition with trust, and it's sad that ministry change would severely damage a relationship, which to me is more important than positions.
Yeah, and that's the value of people, loving, caring for people. That I think is one of the many things I love about our Foursquare tribe is the value that we place on people. Now
Amen.
let's look at turbulence from external forces. Right now as we're recording this, we're still at the depth of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also dealing with riots in the streets. We're dealing with uh, deep, deep divide politically. And one of the unique things about our little Foursquare tribe, our branch of this broad kingdom, is that there's no such thing as a typical Foursquare church. If you go to one Foursquare church, you've been to one Foursquare church. There's no such thing as a typical. I remember talking to one of our leaders, and they just looked at. I said, Jeff, you got to understand, we have churches that are right now. They're almost like Westboro Baptist Church, which is that crazy group that protests everybody, all the way over to almost Rob Bell types, all under the Foursquare umbrella. How do you, as a leader, navigate through all of that? Because I'm sure you've got deep personal views about each one of these issues. And, I keep stumbling on this myself, and my wife and I keep having good, honest discussions about it, because I get very passionate about some of these issues, and I need to constantly pull myself in. So maybe you can mentor me here a little bit, Glenn, but how do you navigate through that uh, social responsibility while at the same time speaking the word of the Lord, speaking the wisdom of God in all of these types of external turbulences that we face?
Boy, Jeff, it's we've never been at a place where there's been so much polarization.
Mm-hmm.
We've always had politics, but boy, in this situation, unless you agree with me about every single thing,
Right.
I mean, I'm looking for a reason to disqualify you rather than a reason to qualify you. So if you don't like this particular situation or that statement or whatever, and it's tough. I do think when you're leading a larger, like you said, a very diverse tribe, I think that's where our moderation identity marker is
Mm-hmm.
important. That we don't rush to reactions,
Mm-hmm.
because frankly, tomorrow's news may change what you knew today.
Right.
And so um, I get a little challenged when, you probably do too. I get 10, 15 videos a day by people who want me to watch what the latest person said or the
Mm-hmm.
latest conspiracy theory or
Oh
whatever. And I'm not
gosh.
saying that some of those aren't true, but I don't live my life like a pinball. I don't want
Right.
to just be all over the map. I think the reason people came around Jesus was because he just didn't get involved in some of that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and what he gave them brought life to them.
Mm.
And so I've tried to use my Facebook medium and my Instagram and my Twitter to speak life, to speak truth that's not going to change in 2020
Mm-hmm.
than it would have in 1000.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I love reading some of C.S. Lewis's stuff that kind of anchors me in a different time period, but it allows me to see the truth of God's word versus the current realities that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so I think you have to filter all of that. My ultimate question for me, Jeff, is what is the Spirit saying to the church?
Mm-hmm.
Not what are you saying, or not what is this leader said or
Mm-hmm.
that leader said. The media depends on whether you go conservative or liberal, and you lean either one of those ways, or you're going to find people that agree with you.
Right.
So I think the key is if we can spend more time in the Word, and what
Mm-hmm.
we give is life. Now, we're going to have people fall on the left and right and Jesus said, hey, they don't receive you, kind of got to dust your shoes off and get on with life. And um, I think we're almost in an apocalyptic kind of a
Mm-hmm.
season where there's anarchy and there's people drawing to themselves teachers that, will tell them what they want to hear. So I just think that we have to be careful. At some point we are going to enter ages where there's such spiritual dynamism in our environment that we're literally confronting spiritual warfare,
Right.
not just political divide and racial injustice, but boy, there's spirits stirring up things that are really opposed to God and opposed to kingdom advancement. And so in the middle of that, though, I think there are broken people who need to be loved, cared for, ministered to, served. And I think the churches that are doing that are going to be the churches on the other side of this that are going to be used by God. If you think about the churches around the world that have exploded during times of persecution and times of unrest, it was where people stayed very steady in their faith,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily jump to one radical idea or another. But I mean, maybe they were radical in terms of their followership of Jesus, but not radical in terms of them trying to follow a certain pattern of thinking or political agenda or whatever. It's difficult. I mean, because I have we all get pulled into conversations, and I want Jesus to be edified. Um, I think that's why I love Four Squares, because we've made this about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think if we keep doing that, when the dust settles, Jeff, um, there'll be other pandemics, hopefully not as dangerous as this one, but there'll be other issues in our world, from famine to economics. But I think the solid thing is that Jesus is same yesterday, today, and forever. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to hang on to. I do think that you have to kind of help guide people and help console people. Fortunately, Randy has engaged this with both hands, and
Mm-hmm.
he feels a real responsibility. He's just come out of pastoring a sizable church. And so I have a lot of confidence in who he has around him and his ability to listen to Jesus and stay on his knees before God. So I think Foursquare is going to be fine, but not if I'll leave you with this verse. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so that's my prayer for us today, is that we don't get sucked into a gravity pull. Just we're not in a drift boat,
Right.
Jeff. We're in a power boat.
Yeah.
So we're not just drifting with wherever the river takes us. We have the Holy Spirit, and He can take us against the stream. He can take us anywhere. So I think as long as we're open to the work of the Holy Spirit, and don't just become people that lose our convictions and our confidence in the Lord, I think we'll be fine.
That's great. Good. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Glenn. Before I let you go, there's one question I always ask every guest on the podcast, and it is this: if we had a time machine and we could go back to your 25-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself?
Um, hmm. Probably to save more money. Um,
Good
I
advice.
just kind of come on the edge of, although Debbie and I are doing fine, but I think I think sometimes Christian leaders can think, oh, Jesus is coming back. And so, but I don't think I would have changed my perspective of being generous and trusting God with my
Hmm.
future. And we're doing fine. But I think it's, whether it's health or resources or whatever, I think I would say to myself, um, plan for the long term, because I think this temple, I think you just do things and you don't, I mean, you think you're going to live forever, and you think you're indestructible. And
Hmm.
I would want to gather around me maybe people, and I think I did, but I would be even more intense about it, gathering people around me whose convictions I valued, and had them shape me even more. And maybe the last one, even though our kids have grown up great, we have awesome relationships, and they say they don't feel abandoned, I probably would say to myself at 25, make sure that you intentionally balance more time for your family, your marriage, yourself, because I think those of us who have a call to ministry can just become so obsessed with the call.
Yeah.
Um, I don't, I, whether it's wrapped into our identity or what, but I just, I don't know that I neglected my kids, but I think there were times when I felt like ministry had to happen, and it just didn't. And so, um, but God gave us grace. We have a healthy family and healthy relationship with all of our kids, and they love Jesus. And so I'm thankful for all of that, but probably would have not burned the midnight oil so much on things that never really mattered.
Yeah.
Maybe other people had expectations, but would have slowed down just a little bit more, I think, and smelled the roses. Which people keep telling me you're never supposed to retire. Well, I understand that you never walk away from your calling, but I tell you, I'm going to enjoy some time with my wife and some time not being responsible for something 70 to 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I think we do earn some time to do that, but probably would have maybe been more intentional about that early in my life. So.
That's good. That's good. Well, Glenn, you've given us so many jewels of wisdom and insight that have come from a life well lived. I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been my pleasure, and love you and Debbie, and pray for you often, and grateful that you're where God's placed you in our family.
Thank you so much. Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jeffroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.